I didn't let her do anything.
You know, it's the best move I ever made.
I want to make excuses to work with this person.
It really made the case for what we now call inclusive prosperity. We got the band back together. This is nice with mics.
Sure. No idea.
And so what was this event?
This was the launch of, was this your arrival, Rich, or launch of MPI?
No, just kidding.
Launch of MPI?
I was so tired because we drove from Michigan. And then the people who were supposed to unpack just dumped it in there. So me and Rana were trying to unpack. It's like the day we moved.
Yeah.
Cool. Like we moved for the day.
Back in the mid-2000s, Joseph Rotman, the man who the Rotman School, where we're based in Toronto, is named after, came to then-Dean Roger Martin, offering him the financial support needed to build his own think tank. Excited by the opportunity, Roger immediately called up Richard Florida, someone he'd wanted to work with for some time. Then in 2007, Roger and Richard officially launched the Martin Prosperity Institute with a big bash attended by friends, family, and politicians. Welcome to Shiftdisturbers, the MPI podcast where we highlight the people, research, and ideas that change the way we think about the world. I'm Ian Gormley, writer and content producer here at the Martin Prosperity Institute at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management. We're back after a brief summer break with an episode that celebrates the 10-year anniversary of MPI. In light of this landmark, I sat down with Roger and Richard to talk about their first meeting, the Institute's origins, and how their thinking around prosperity has changed over the past decade. In 1998, Roger Martin moved from being a senior partner in a strategy consulting firm in Boston to becoming dean of the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. By all accounts, under his tenure as dean, the school became one of the most admired business schools in North America and around the globe. But Roger remained interested in jurisdictional advantage, what makes one place more attractive to businesses over another. And that led him to the work of a then relatively unknown economic geographer named Richard Florida.
It was 1998 when I came and started as dean, and I really felt that Canada needed a fantastic business school, and the best place was in Toronto at the University of Toronto. But the whole idea of we've got to figure out how to make sure this is a great city that incubates great companies, grows and supports great companies, so that this place would be a great place for both families to want to live and raise their kids, and artists would want to be here, and corporations would think this is a great place to launch from. So when I first heard about the work that you were doing, I was saying, wow, he's doing this from a different perspective. It was the urban geography perspective, but it was so simpatico with the sort of competitive advantage perspective as well. It just seemed like a match made in heaven.
The two were introduced at a party in Toronto held by a mutual friend.
I got introduced to Richard by a dear friend of both of us, Heather Monroe Bloom, who was then at University of Toronto. She was the vice president of research and international, and then she went to McGill, and she had a party at her place in Forest Hill, and said, Roger, you've got to come because there's this guy, Richard Florida, who you're going to love. And I knew about Rich, but I'd never met him. And we talked there for the first time. I think it was 2000 or 2001. Do you remember, Rich?
Yeah, roughly 2000 or 2001, before Rise of the Creative Class.
And at that time, we talked and said, well, we've got to talk some more. And we kept in touch. And I tried, long before MPI, I tried to get Rich up here funded by a grant from the Ontario government, and this wasn't hardcore scientific enough for the government of the day to support, but I stayed in touch.
I remember Heather Monroe Bloom said to me that you have to meet Roger, but she actually said a slightly different comment. She said you will either love one another or hate one another. And I was so happy that at least to my mind, we loved one another.
Absolutely.
And then Roger, you invited me over to your house. And we drank at least one bottle of wine, maybe more.
I think it was 2.
Yeah, at least. And we talked about how we might create. You at that time were working on all of the varied things you do, but also this construct of jurisdictional advantage. And could we envision some kind of activity or center to do that? And I thought it was really cool. And plus, I mean, I was living in Pittsburgh, a wonderful city, but a city that was not Toronto. I'm teaching at Carnegie Mellon. No one ever really talked about the University of Toronto, and no one mentioned the Rotman School. Until one day, it must have been in the late 1990s, but people said, you know, the Rotman School is really, really good. And, you know, Bill McKevely is going there, and this other one is going there, and this other one is going there. And all these people are giving seminars, and a guy named Joel Bauman's there, and they have this dean called Roger Martin. And it was like a place that you never heard of. I'm not kidding, that you never heard of. All of a sudden at Carnegie Mellon was seen to be like the place. So it was that kind of nexus that I think I luckily stepped into, and then we met.
Forces beyond his control stymied Roger's attempts to bring Richard to Toronto in the early 2000s. But Roger isn't one to give up on something if he thinks it's a good idea, so he and Richard kept in touch. Several years later, Roger was presented with an opportunity he couldn't pass up, and Richard was once again top of mind.
And this somehow really was driven by the magnificent, wonderful late Joe Rotman, who was the best benefactor a school could ever have. And he was very appreciative of what we managed to do here at the school. And so when I finished my first term, which was 7 years, so that would have been in 2005, he just called me up and said, Sandy, his wife, and he had been thinking, and they wanted to give something to say thank you to me for having led the school well in that first term, and agreed to serve for another 5-year term. And he said, and I'll always remember, he said, we'll give you $10 million to do whatever kind of thing you want. The only requirement is that it's got to have your name on it. And he said, if you're not game to have your name on it, sorry, no $10 million. You know, Joe was being clever, because Joe knew the last thing I would want to do is have my name on something. But he also knew enough to know that if we could do something great with $10 million, I would suck it up and do that. Though interesting enough, the university says you can't name anything after an existing professor. And so the clever integrative solution was it's named after my parents. So everybody thinks it's the Roger Martin Prosperity Institute, but it's actually the Lloyd and Delphine Martin Prosperity Institute. So with that $10 million, the absolutely first thing I thought of is, man, we failed with it. Was an attempted funding by ORDCF that would have funded Richard to come up here and set up something. I said, okay, now we've got it. And Rich and I wanted to do something that was kind of out there. So I said, great, $10 million, that'll do the trick. And I called up Rich and said, hey, Rich, I think we've now got an opening. Are you still interested?
And you called me. I was living in Washington, D.C., and kind of had just renovated a house and just gotten married. My wife, Rana, just moved there. And I remember what you said. You said, remember I told you I wouldn't give up on this? Like, whoa. Remember I told you I wasn't going to, I never take no for an answer. Would you come up and help run or organize this new institute? And I said, yes. I have to clear it with Rana, but I said her family's from Michigan, so this is not going to be, we both know Toronto and love it. This is not going to be a hard sell. And I think I actually came up, we did a dinner at your house with Joe Rotman and Sandy. And what really just, I couldn't believe it. Within a couple of days, I got an email from Joe Rotman. Like a long email, not a paragraph, talking about how great it would be if I would come, how complimentary I would be to what you have built in the school, and saying almost precisely what he said to you. And the only requirement is that it be excellent. Whatever you want to do is great. The only requirement is to be excellent. And I think I shot you off an email or called you. I said, this has never happened to me. A benefactor or donor's never written me an email. I'm sort of in shock, Of course I'm going to come. I told you I'm going to come, but this just is amazing. And then we were off and running.
Roger pursued Richard not just because of Richard's extraordinary work. Roger also believes that Richard is an original thinker.
When I see one who does truly original thinking and research, and it's in a territory near to me, I just sort of just sort of glom onto them and say, I want to make excuses to work with this person. And there's many kinds of excuses to make. Like if Richard would have said, I have, 3 kids in the public school system or the elementary school system in Pittsburgh or Washington, and I can't leave. Then I would have figured out a different excuse. But I just want to find excuses to work with them, and that was Rich. Rich is an original thinker who's shaped a field, and it happens to be a field that is sort of co-located with what I'm interested in, and so I wasn't about to give up.
For his part, Richard's stock had risen enormously since the two first met. He'd become an in-demand public intellectual after Rise of the Creative Class was published in 2002. He'd left Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh for Washington, D.C., and most likely had his pick of future career opportunities. So moving to Toronto, which was, of course, in an entirely different country, was no small leap.
Yeah, remember the time George W. Bush was president. It was not quite the Trump administration, but there was the war in Iraq. There was immigration restrictions in the United States. I had just written a book called The Flight of the Creative Class, talking about the role of immigration restrictions, closing borders, becoming a less attractive place for talent. And the other thing I talked about in that book was many scientific researchers were finding it harder to raise money in the U.S. context. And here was a great university and a great business school in a better city. I was in Washington, D.C., but I think Washington, D.C. is a great city. Toronto is a more cosmopolitan city. It's more varied in its interests. And I liked Washington a lot. But here it was, and the opportunity to go to those places and have long-term research support. And close to my wife's family, less than half the distance. It was like no-brainer. And I know this sounds foolish because Canada and America are so close to one another, but I had really never lived anywhere outside the United States. And people would say, well, it's Canada. What's that? It's not like going to India or China or Africa, but it is really different. So for all those reasons, the timing couldn't have been better. And by the way, I had already thought about this because 5 or 6 years previous, Roger and I had done this. But I think great city, great university, and really importantly, this idea of having a continued long-run research funding were all the reasons. And, it's the best move I ever made.
So that was the start, and the funny story on that was that I was like enamored with jurisdictional advantage. This notion of what is it that a jurisdiction can do to gain competitive advantage, and I believe that my draft name for this was the Center for Jurisdictional Advantage and Prosperity, I think.
No, that's exactly right.
Was it that?
Course,
okay.
That's exactly right.
And the wonderful Dalton McGuinty and Gerald Butts were really interested in what we were doing and trying to support it, and had the opportunity, because at the year end they had some money left to help us fund a project, which was to create a physical home for MPI, and I was in discussions with Dalton, and being sort of the great politician, he would connect with people so well. I was talking about the idea, and he was like, You're seriously going to call it that? I'm like, I would take it aback a little bit, because it was like, because he you could tell he was sort of joking and sort of like really serious, right? He was sort of trying to make a bit of a joke out of it, but he was really serious that he thought that was like about the dumbest name imaginable. And he said, this is really about, kind of Ontario and Toronto's prosperity, right? And I said, yeah, Dalton, that's what it is. He said, well, how about the Prosperity Institute? And I thought, yeah, that's probably a better name. So the guy who named this, well, I guess 2 people named it. Dalton gave it the Prosperity Institute, and Joe Rotman gave it the Martin. And so it ended up being Martin Prosperity Institute, thanks to the intervention of those 2 people.
The first major collaboration between Roger and Richard emerged in 2009. Called Ontario in the Creative Age, the report offered a prescient view of Ontario's economy while offering public policy solutions to ensure future success. Most notably, it hit on the idea of inclusive prosperity that continues to be a running theme in our work to this very day.
It was hard while I was dean to carve out the time to do major work with Rich. So I wish I would have been able to do more. But this was a great opportunity when the Ontario government came to us and said, "Hey, you're doing all this interesting work on the creative class and the future. We need to understand Ontario in this context." And it was perfect. It was a great excuse for us to work together on a major piece of work. And I've done a bunch of policy stuff over time, and what makes me happiest is when I can look back on something that was increasingly a long time ago and say, it holds up well. And I think that's a piece of work that holds up very well. I'm not sure, if Rich and I went back at that and did a rewrite of it, I'm just not sure how much we'd change. It's I think a view of the economy that, some things good have happened on that front in terms of policy. Others haven't, but I think the analysis and the prescriptions were good.
It was cool because one you had a province and a premier that was an interesting policy locus, but two, I think that report, you're talking about 8-9 years ago, it really made the case for what we now call inclusive prosperity. It really uncorked that. And, it wasn't just about building an innovative and creative Ontario. It was about the 45 or 50% of people who are doing these routine service jobs, the largest part of our labor market, who are being left behind. And, later on, there was all this concern for inequality and the 1%, and Thomas Piketty, but this was anticipating that.
Yep.
And so that's what I find. I find my work in the New Urban Crisis, the joint work we did together, looking at clusters more recently. I think that this, Ontario in the Creative Age, anticipated all of that. And it was also a way to make this work relevant to Canada at a time where I really believe that report, whether it's acknowledged or not, still shapes the way this province thinks about itself. And looking at the current premier, right at this day, and her attempt to carve out a new identity and build around inclusive prosperity, deal with poverty and workers that are left behind. They may not go back and reference that exact document, but those ideas, I think, very much have influenced. And I would say, and if I look around jurisdictions in North America, Ontario right now looks like it is probably, now it has many problems of productivity and innovation and lags, but in terms of developing an agenda for more inclusive prosperity, it looks like it's pretty close to the cutting edge. You could argue California may be doing some of it, Massachusetts. But I think this set of issues really got through to the community, if you will, to the mental model that people have about what it would take to build not only a more productive, but a more inclusively prosperous place. So I'm really proud of that.
Yeah, and I love also the theme that we then explored in that later paper, whenever that was, 2 years ago or so, where we just combined two lenses. The kind of what is it that causes companies to want to be a place and prosper in a place, with what does it take to get people to want to be in a place and prosper in a place. And one of the things I felt way back when we were starting MPI was that policymakers in jurisdictions, whether it be a premier or a mayor, get narrow advice. Somebody who cares about green space and parks says, this is what you got to do. Somebody who cares about transportation grids says, this is what you got to do. And this poor mayor or prime minister or premier is sitting there saying, well, I could do what this guy wants, I could do what that gal wants, etc. But they're all contradictory. How can I see the whole picture? And I think Ontario in the Creative Age really started merging two very different pictures into a more integrated whole. And I wouldn't be surprised, Rich, if maybe that's why it's sticking, is that it speaks to the person who's sitting in a place where they have to make those more holistic decisions.
I think Roger's building of the brand of the Rotman School and his participation in that and bringing an eye to Toronto and its excellence, and this report and our research There are a reason that Toronto's now ending up on short lists for places like Amazon and Google and high-tech companies, and shaping a narrative about this transformation and how it was occurring in the assets of the place, I think helped. So when you said, 8 or 9 years ago, what was Ontario? A place that the car industry was dying, and how do we bail it out? Now the conversation about Ontario still has to deal with all the inequities, but it's about a place that's literally probably as close to the cutting edge of knowledge-based capitalism as any place in Canada ever might have been. So It's a pretty long road that shaping that narrative has happened.
From the beginning, Roger and Richard knew they wanted the work coming out of MPI to make an impact. That meant influencing the people who make public policy in both Canada and beyond. Over the years, that's evolved from issue-specific solutions to crafting a broad way of thinking about a wide range of issues.
I think we have much more of a view now of what could be helpful to jurisdictional leaders in terms of making strategy choices. What levers can they pull to improve their jurisdiction in a more holistic way, not in a piecemeal way? And it's something we've talked about doing, which is in some sense taking the stuff I've written about in Playing to Win, which is advice to CEOs on how to think about that, and saying, well, how would that work in a city context? And frankly, some people sort of think, oh man, we gotta have city people be more like businessmen and women. I'm not quite there. It's sort of like it in cities or provinces, jurisdictions. It's like business, only a lot more complicated. So we can't just sort of say, oh, we can just get them to be like business people. But what my hope is we can take some of those business principles and then add a lot of thought to them that comes from the work of Rich and others to give a better holistic toolbox, not just the same one imported over. Couldn't they just be smart like business people? No, it's how could we give them a better toolbox? And I think because Rich hangs around with mayors way more than I do, I take on faith your view that they do not have a toolbox. There isn't somebody coming to them with a great holistic toolbox, and I think that's the next place to go to equip them as well as we attempt to equip the CEOs of big companies.
Yeah, and remember, we've only been together office neighbors for a couple years. Roger had a real job, and he had to run a school, and that takes a lot of cycles. So to be able for us to talk and think together has only been a little bit of time. You wrote me an incredible memo when we first met, which I still have, in which you talked about the difference between gurus and consultants. And what you said to me is, Rich, you're kind of a guru. You weren't being insulting. You were just saying, this is what you do. You think big. You had all sort of kind names like Peter Drucker and others that you said were similar to me, and I didn't know this. But consultants do something very different. They don't just give big things. They actually create toolboxes. They create not only paradigms, they create executable tools, and they actually work and they scale. They develop other people they work with and teams to scale these things. And that's not what you do. So don't make that mistake. And I think the real challenge is, how do you take a big idea like this and then make it more executable, build the tools? And I think that's something where together with a team of people who are younger and very diligent and excited about this, that we could do that. We could begin to craft a toolbox, if you will, or the ideas behind the toolbox, or the framework for a toolbox that public leaders, city leaders could use, because they don't have it right now.
Most recently, both Roger and Richard have, in their own ways, begun to confront the increasing prevalence of routine service work and its contributions to income inequality. Working closely with MPI fellow Zainab Tan, they hope to convince companies to convert such positions into creative, good jobs.
A big chunk of the objective function for that mayor or premier or president or prime minister that we are talking to, their job, almost more so than anything else, should be to create an environment, a jurisdiction that produces better jobs for as many people as possible. And so I think if we're going to give tools for how do you build a jurisdiction that has that feature, we need to understand why we have so many bad jobs now. It's part of the way the economy has evolved, and how to convert those bad jobs to good jobs. If we can do that, I think we can have a more useful toolbox. That has got to be a major focus, and that is a key to whether a jurisdiction is living up to its potential and contributing to the world or not.
I've long seen the evolution of economies in terms of the unleashing or capturing of human capabilities or human potentials. And I just thought, what makes a great manufacturing company? It's not the one that treats workers like crap. What made Toyota a kind of breakthrough company is that it treated its workers well, it paid them highly, it gave them lifetime, believe it or not, a guarantee of lifetime employment in return for the fact that they would use their brain. And not their brain individually, but they would use their collective brain of all the other workers that they would be in a team with, not to break the assembly line, but actually to make that enterprise, they were the anti-Luddites. They were the people who were continuously improving and innovating on the factory floor. I've always thought about strategy being something a leader, a CEO, a political leader, a business leader. But what we even lack today is any sense of how to build a broad economic strategy. And I think that's the other plane that our work acts on.
Mm-hmm.
People see this and they go, oh, there's an unemployment problem. Oh, there's an inequality problem. Oh, well, more education. Okay, that's good. Oh, well, we'll create more knowledge jobs. And I think they missed the point that 100 years ago, when people did have an economic strategy, people like Henry Ford said, unless those factory workers have enough money to buy a car and enough money to buy a house, the economy is going to stay really crappy for a long time. So what if we created some institutional levers? We might not like them. Give workers the right to organize a union. We don't like that. But what if we gave them a long-term mortgage instrument, and they could then get higher wages, demand higher wages, and they could use that money to buy a house, and we would get economic demand. That's the other part that people don't think of. They think of, well, these very siloed, simple-minded solutions. But if you pay these workers in these low-wage, precarious service jobs more, if you involve them in their jobs, if you tap their brain, well, duh. So there were all these inputs coming at us, and really trying to make that 50% of current crappy jobs, 6 million in Canada, 60 million and 65 million in the U.S., better jobs, seemed to us a very, and still though, that's a hard message to get. I mean,
yeah,
it's still a message that's hard to get across, and we've been plugging at it, the two of us, in a non-trivial way for 5 or 6 years.
A lot of these things have to happen at the micro level, right? You can't legislate for good jobs. You have to convince companies to be able to do it. Then I think we have to be saying to heads of jurisdictions, how do you want to act so that your jurisdiction will be the most welcoming, the most supportive for the kinds of companies and organizations that are game to pursue this good job strategy, so that you get the whole flywheel going. The same thing that Henry Ford did way back when. You've got all these workers who are getting paid more because they're using their brain more, and they have more disposable income that requires there to be more products to produce and more economic growth. And it's not a zero-sum game. It's not a trade-off game. It's a positive-sum game where more and more people can win.
Upgrading routine service jobs, and more broadly, exploring the future of work, will be key focuses of MPI's research for the foreseeable future. Tackling such wicked problems are certain to keep our plates full, but everyone here at MPI feels up to the task. That brings us to the end of this episode of Shiftdisturbers. Hopefully you found this look back through MPI history interesting and maybe even enlightening. A big thanks to Roger and Richard for taking the time to speak with me. This episode was written and produced by myself, Ian Gormley. If you want to know more about the Martin Prosperity Institute, head over to martinprosperity.org or follow us on Twitter at Martin Prosperity. That's MartinProsperit. To make sure you don't miss an episode of Shiftdisturbers, click the subscribe button. And if you like what you hear, please take a minute to leave us a review or shout us out on social media. Once again, I'm Ian Gormley, and thank you for listening.